So basically, they've created a really awful disco that's so bad.
worst.
that
So bad
don't
that fish
wanna-
leave. Yeah, it's the
And it's cost
opposite.
15 million quid.
And I'm just going to call out the scientific propaganda here.
worst
It's not a
disco.
disco, it's a fish alarm. It's a fish siren.
Yeah, it's absolutely
It's really
not.
telling them to go away.
It's like a fish bouncer rather than a fish disco.
Hi, welcome to the Climate Question from the BBC World Service. This week we're answering your comments and your questions, including why isn't there more tidal power? And are estuaries vulnerable to climate change? I'm your host, Greer Jackson. And just to say, if you have a question for us, please do comment it below and we'll feature it in a future show. Now, let me introduce you to our panel. We have the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowland.
Oh, hiya. Yeah, very nice to be here.
Presenter of Crowd Science on the BBC World Service, Caroline Steele.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. And Akshat Rati, who is a senior climate reporter at Bloomberg Green.
It's great to be here.
Now, our first question is from Drusilla. She writes, what happened with tidal power? The French have been doing it for ages, and I've practiced this pronunciation at Laurence since 1966. And in the UK, we have superior coastal inlets. So when will we start? The tide at Swansea Docks is one of the highest in the world, from 10 to 13 metres twice a day. Just to flag, we do actually have some tidal power in the UK. We'll come back round to that. But Caroline, what are the different ways that we can produce energy from the sea?
Yeah, there's a lot of untapped energy in the ocean that basically comes from rising and falling tides and moving water. And there's kind of three main ways we can harvest it. So there are tidal stream generators, which are basically like wind turbines underwater. And we can place them on the sea floor or hang them upside down from rafts in areas where rising and falling tides produces fast flowing currents, and that rotates the blades, and those rotating blades go on to produce electricity. And there are sort of pockets of these all over the world, in Japan, Norway, and off the coast of Scotland, between mainland Scotland and Orkney, I think. I imagine you've been there, Justin.
I haven't been there, no, but there are.
There is what- that's where they
there's a
are.
research station on Orkney where they do this kind of stuff.
And they've got both the turbine sat on the floor and dangling upside down.
And they've got an amazing one that sort of flies like a kite.
Oh, cool. And what the current moves it.
In the stream, in the current, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, and then another way is tidal barrages. So that's like in Laurence, not as good as your pronunciation.
Good attempt.
Which is basically where you build a sort of dam across an estuary or a bay, and then as the tide comes in and the water level rises, the water on the sort of riverside of the, if it's an estuary, of the dam fills up, and then you shut it, the tide goes down and the water level stays high in the estuary. And then once the difference between the water in the estuary and the ocean gets big enough, you sort of open it up, let the water flow out, and it turns turbines as it comes out.
Like a hydroelectric dam.
Exactly like a hydroelectric dam, yeah. And then there's one last option. So there are tidal lagoons, and there aren't any kind of operating commercially right now. And they work in a similar way to tidal barrages. Basically, they're a sort of loop against the coast, and they trap water in as the tide comes up and let it flow out again. There's one been proposed to be built in Swansea Bay in Wales in the UK, which may or may not happen. But at the moment, it's being estimated to cost $1.6 billion. So pretty expensive, but this might be something we see in the future.
Justin, let's talk about the climate benefits.
Well, can I just first of all say, I mean, on this competition between the British and the French, I thought it was interesting. Drusilla noted our superior tidal basins, but we've been generating tidal power for more than 1,000 years. There's a tidal mill in Suffolk at Woodbridge, which is a lagoon. It captures the tide as the water and then releases the water through the mill to grind corn. So, I mean, this is a technology that's been known for a really long time. I mean, obviously, the benefit is that potentially this is low carbon if the infrastructure doesn't have a huge carbon cost attached to it. But there are issues about the amount of energy we get out. I mean, we are investing here in Britain as part of our investment in renewables. It's quite heavily subsidised, tidal power, to see whether we can develop any of these technologies to the point at which they become competitive with other technologies. And you've got to remember that this is a competition. You know, there's a market here, and if solar's really, really cheap and really effective, and you can marry it with batteries and get, you know, good power, Why wouldn't you use that? Why would you choose something that technically is really quite challenging? It's really quite difficult to operate machines in salty water for a long time.
I want to come to the sort of the technical issues with Akshat, but I also wanted to say I thought one of the other key benefits of tidal is that it's very predictable. The tides you can predict like a decade in advance, whereas other renewables like wind and solar, it's very weather dependent.
In theory, it's base load power. You know, when the tide's coming in and coming out, and therefore you get predictable energy that allows you to have a base load power. If you're running a data center, you need to know you've got firm power, and in theory, tidal power could deliver that kind of firm power, which is actually really valuable power.
I was just going to say another benefit is the fact that water is 800 times more dense than air. So you don't need that fast flowing water to generate quite a lot of power, although the turbines or dams or whatever it is you're building need to be really robust.
Actually, what are some of the problems? Because tidals, I really struggled actually to find stats on how much tidal energy is produced today, but it's vanishingly small, and it's still expected to be vanishingly small by 2030 and 2050. A drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
I wrote here on my script.
Very clever.
Well done.
What is holding it back? Is it the technology? Is it the geography? Is it the cost?
It's engineering challenges and engineering challenges, really, because engineering challenges in making the materials last, as Justin was saying, in the sea, in salty water for that long a time. Sure, we've had ships and we've done a lot of marine engineering, so we know a bunch, but these are machines that are moving constantly and have to be maintained in that space, producing that power. So that's one challenge. The other is they're not small. These turbines are actually large, very heavy. And so the other engineering challenge is when you are making something that is large, and often for tidal lagoons, etc., they are purpose-built projects. So you have to really design it for that purpose in that particular geography. That is more expensive than making something millions of times, like a solar panel or like a lithium-ion battery, which you can then make in a factory and then transport it anywhere in the world, and it will just work.
So economies of scale and the fact that it's got to withstand a good bashing under the sea. I think we haven't also really talked about the geography, and you need quite a specific geography to work, like narrow channels, like estuaries, which we're going to be coming on to in a minute, mean you get that fast-flowing water for the turbines to spin.
And you need a big tidal range for things like tidal barrages. I think it has to be at least 5 metre difference between high tide and low tide, so that it's not appropriate for everyone.
I've actually got a list. There's not that many places. According to the International Energy Agency, Northern Ireland, South Korea, which has one of the biggest tidal barrages in the world, UK, Russia, North America, France, Central America and Argentina. Justin, the other concern is wildlife. Can it harm wildlife?
Yeah, of course it can. You've got these big turbines in water. That's going to be a challenge for wildlife moving through it. So it can be very damaging. And if you build lagoons, and this is the big argument against the Swansea Lagoon that we were talking about, you change the flow of water in the estuary, and that can be really damaging to wildlife. And so, actually that Swansea Lagoon was proposed something like 20 or 30 years ago. And it's going back and forth in the planning process because there's this really difficult balance of costs and benefits.
Yeah.
So, potentially really big impact locally on wildlife. And then, of course, you've got to balance that against the benefits of, of low carbon power.
I did speak to some industry representatives on a previous edition of The Climate Question, and they said that the blades actually go so slowly that actually you don't end up with sushi kind of thing.
I think the concern is more that fish might kind of swim away from them, and if they're placed in shallower areas, which they often are, that's key habitat for lots of different species.
Caroline, talk to us about fish discos.
Yes, so I have a wildlife story. It's not related to tidal power, but instead nuclear power. So nuclear power plants require a lot of water to cool them down, and this usually comes from oceans or from rivers. So basically there are sort of inlet pipes that have a grate over the front of them, and they suck in water, which is a problem for fish that often get stuck against the grates or pass in through the grates. Either way, they likely die. It's a particular problem at Hinkley Point C in Somerset in the UK, where they're using water from the River Severn, which is a really important breeding ground for lots of protected species of fish. So scientists have been trying to come up with a way to protect these fish. And basically, they have come up with a fish disco.
Right. Is this? I've got so much mental imagery flying around my mind. I'm thinking nearby they've put up a disco ball
and the fish are sort of dancing around.
Away.
So what they've done is they've lowered speakers onto the floor of the estuary, and the speakers are pumping out ultrasound, which fish can hear and feel. And the idea is that the fish will swim away from the sound and therefore away from the inlet pipes and be protected. So they've just run a trial, scientists at Swansea University, and they've tagged different species of fish, particularly the Thwaite shad, which is a protected fish that looks a bit like a herring apparently. And they found that before they turned these speakers on, so before the disco began, 14 Thwaite shad swam really close to the pipes.
Hold on,
and
14.
14,
Okay.
yes. The other species, I'm picking my favourite
No,
species.
just
14
the
swam,
shad.
swam really near the pipes. Whereas when they turned the speakers on, only one Thwaite shad swam near the pipes. So it's looking hopeful. Different bodies have estimated different numbers of fish that could be saved, but it's all in the orders of millions. But I think what Justin's going to say is that's could be similar to the catch of one fishing vessel in one day. It's a lot of work and a lot of money. The disco part of it costs 50 million.
So basically, they've created a really awful disco that's so bad.
worst-
that
So
fish
bad
don't
for fish
wanna-
leave. Yeah, it's the
And it's cost
opposite of a disco.
15 million quid.
And I'm just going to call out the scientific propaganda here.
worst
It's not a
disco.
disco, it's a fish alarm. It's a fish siren.
Yeah, it's absolutely
It's
not.
really telling them to go away.
It's like a fish bouncer rather than a fish disco.
And we should also say, just for people outside of Britain, this got a huge amount of criticism in the press for spending all this money to save, a few fish. So again, which points to how difficult these things are to do successfully.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's sort of the other option that was being considered before the fish disco looks
You
quite
love fish
successful.
disco. Yeah,
Say it
you're not
anyway.
letting go.
was to flood farmland further up the river to basically compensate for loss further downstream.
Oh, a fish offset, you mean?
Exactly. So yeah, also this in defence of fish discos, this is really expensive. But, the first time doing anything is really expensive. If it ends up being a viable solution, we might be able to roll it out at nuclear
Shads
power.
around the world are going to rejoice, aren't
celebrating,
they?
yeah. We won't be able to move the shad.
Now that brings us on to our final question from Mark, who writes, my daughter works for Nature Trust here in British Columbia, monitoring estuaries for climate resilience. So my climate question is, are estuaries, which are such important, productive ecosystems, vulnerable to climate change? I know the answer is yes, because I looked it up in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, but maybe we should just roll back a little bit and say, what is an estuary and why are they so vulnerable?
Estuaries are where rivers meet the sea. They're really important habitats. And I think they're partly so vulnerable because they are both exposed to ocean climate change and climate change that we see in rivers. And they're a delicate balance between salt water and fresh water. There's a lot of important species in estuaries that rely on it being just the right salinity, and lots of different things can throw it out of whack, which makes them particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, so, you talked about the coastal winds and currents and then seasonal rainfall, snow melt coming in. But the other reason it's sort of quite vulnerable is because there's often lots of building and development and harbours that sort of add further challenges. I have to admit, I was quite amazed when I went to an estuary. I think it was in the Sundarbans on the sort of Indian-Bangladeshi border. I'd never seen a mud skipper before. And I thought they were the weirdest creature I've ever seen.
What do they look like? What do they do? I've not
They're
seen one.
half fish, half frog. And
Yeah, they sort of
flap
come out
around
of
on
the water and
They've
they-
got wings and they sort of jump around on the mud, but they're a fish.
Wow.
They're really odd.
I mean, those estuaries are amazing. They've also got tigers.
Yeah.
Really?
And
Yeah,
they are
Sundarbans
adapted
tigers,
to that type of environment, and they're
swim.
really good. And they swim, of course.
You were swimming yesterday in an estuary, you were saying.
I was,
earlier.
yeah, well, I mean, it is an estuary. Well, it's a harbour. It's a harbour. It's kind of, there are rivers that flow into it. The Poole Harbour in the south of England. Yeah, I mean, estuaries are very vulnerable. Estuaries carry the water from the river into the kind of estuary. So any waste or pollution that's in there, any nitrogen fertiliser going into the river is going to go into the sea. And often they're slightly enclosed. The one I was in, Poole Harbour, is a massive kind of effectively a tidal lagoon. And obviously that then captures that kind of pollution and waste in the area and then concentrates it. So they're really vulnerable to pollution and very easily damaged. And as you say, that brackish water is often essential. The mixed clean and salty water is often essential for specific forms of life. And because they tend to be separate from each other, often you've got species that are specific to individual estuaries, which again makes them really vulnerable to
I was
extinction
amazed
threat.
because they're also like breeding grounds for fish that we then eat, but also all the trees and plants there, they hold back the sediment so that they don't get washed into things like coral reefs, for example, which can't survive with that sort of silty, murky water. But
And they really are so perfect for fish nurseries, basically, because they have shallow water, kind of murky water, which doesn't look very nice to us, but it's great if you're a baby fish trying not to be eaten by a predator because it's hard to be seen, and they're really nutrient rich. And as Justin said, they sort of lots of sediment settles at the bottom of estuaries, cleans water which goes out into the ocean, and also they're good carbon sinks, although this might be something where you slightly disagree, because in this sediment, they trap lots of carbon, and there are lots of sort of estuary specific plants that store carbon as well.
Seagrass, for example.
Seagrass, very
Seagrass.
important.
Very- very
Unsung
Considered
hero.
to be, yeah.
Well, we're talking about it because of climate change, but really this is a good reminder that there are all sorts of ecosystems which are being harmed by all sorts of other human activities, way more, and ones that we can act on and try and protect without worrying about climate change, that we must. But somehow, because we've prioritized climate change, we end up trying to figure out what are the climate solutions to these problems. But even if we tackle climate change, there's still the other human problems of overbuilding, of pollutants that need to be addressed.
That's a really, really good point. And some of these are easier to address. And I was at, as I say, Poole Harbour in Dorset here in England, and there was a nature reserve in a place called Arne, which is incredibly biodiverse. It's got all 6 of Britain's, reptile species. And I bring it up because I think it was bought in about 1950 and then established a nature reserve. And it's this incredible reservoir of kind of wild animals, including white-tailed eagles. So an incredibly rich ecosystem that's been re-established over the last, 70 years. And it shows what can be achieved when we put our mind to it. It's actually tiny. I mean, it's a mile square or something. It really isn't that big, probably a bit bigger than that, but not huge compared to, and yet you can recover an ecosystem and have this incredible diversity. So, speaking to kind of, things that should make us feel optimistic about climate is the degree of change that we can bring by quite small actions, really.
Well, that takes us to the end of the show. Thank you so much to our guests, Akshat Rathi, Caroline Steele and Justin Rayland.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Fun as always.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget, if you have a climate question that you'd like us to answer, please do comment it below and we'll try and answer it in a future show. And whilst you're there, why not subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing? I've been your host, Greer Jackson, and I'll see you next time.